The 1980s had big hair, loud music, and fast cars. But some engines were so bad, they made drivers want to cry. These are the 10 most hated muscle car engines ever built. And they earned every bit of their terrible reputation. Number 10, 280 cubic inch SOHC modular V8, 1995. If you ever wanted to know what happens when a car company takes a big, shiny idea and turns it into a long, frustrating headache, meet the Ford 2 180 cubic inch SOHC modular V8 from 1995. On paper, it looked like the future, but once drivers popped the hood and lived with it, the smiles quickly turned into groans. And trust me, when mechanics joke about charging extra just for touching an engine, you know it is not loved. The first problem was right in the design. Ford promised a new modular way of making engines, which sounded smart. But the 280 cubic inch SOHC was a square peg trying to fit into too many round holes. It was put into cars, trucks, vans, even police cruisers. The dream was one motor for everything, but the result was one motor that disappointed in everything. Too heavy for cars, too weak for trucks, and too annoying for the poor folks who had to work on it. Now let us talk about power, or better yet, the lack of it. This V8 came with 2 valves per cylinder and single overhead cams, which sounded modern back in the day. But in reality, the numbers were dull. Even with performance-improved heads later on, it still struggled to feel exciting. Imagine bringing balloons to a birthday party only to find out they were filled with plain air instead of helium. That is how drivers felt pressing the gas pedal. And oh, the space under the hood. Working on this engine was like trying to play the game operation while wearing oven mitts. Spark plugs were buried deep in narrow holes, coil packs hid in awkward spots, and timing chains stretched out like a nightmare spaghetti dinner. Mechanics often said you needed triple-jointed elbows and a dictionary of new swear words just to change simple parts. But the fun did not stop there. Timing chains in this motor had a habit of rattling, and if you ignored the sound, you could end up with bent valves or worse. The plastic intake manifolds, they like to crack right in the middle, spraying coolant like a leaky garden hose across the engine bay. Drivers learned quickly that steam under the hood was not magic. It was a busted intake, but that's not all. This motor came in different versions from different plants: Romeo, Windsor, even aluminum Texid blocks. In real life, it meant confusion. Bolt patterns, heads, covers, and even cam gears were not the same. Imagine building a puzzle where half the pieces were from another box. Even when Ford tried to fix things with the so-called performance-improved heads, problems stayed. Sure, airflow got a little better and horsepower went up. But new headaches followed. The higher compression caused detonation issues, and the different intake setups confused owners who tried swapping parts. If you did not know exactly which block you had, Romeo or Windsor, you were in for a long, painful surprise, and we cannot forget the sound. Some V8s rumble with thunder, but this one droned like a tired vacuum cleaner. It was not scary, not exciting, just sort of there. Owners waiting for that deep muscle car growl ended up with. Number 9, Oldsmobile's 350 cubic inch diesel V8. The Oldsmobile 350 cubic inch diesel V8 is famous for making people cry, sweat, and curse all at the same time. It promised diesel fuel economy, an American V8 charm. In reality, it delivered headaches, smoke, and endless trips to the mechanic. This engine became one of the most hated motors ever made in the United States. And once you hear why, you might never look at a diesel V8 the same way again. Let's start with power. The LF9 made 120 horsepower at 3,600 revolutions per minute when it first came out in 1978, which is not a lot for a V8. By the early 1980s, engineers detuned it for better fuel economy, leaving it with just 105 horsepower and 205 pound-feet of torque. Imagine a car with 8 cylinders that sounds like a grumpy lawnmower, struggles to move, and belches black smoke whenever you try to go faster than a gentle crawl. Drivers quickly realized that performance was not the selling point. Next comes the engine's reliability, or lack thereof. This diesel V8 was plagued with corroded fuel injector pumps that would fail at the worst times, head gasket leaks that turned warm drives into puddles of coolant on your driveway, and leaky oil pans that left mysterious puddles wherever the car parked. Water in the fuel? That was basically a death sentence for the injector pumps. The fuel pump timing chains stretched. The turbo-hydromatic 3-speed automatic transmission paired with it had constant problems, and no one could explain why a diesel V8 could make so much smoke while barely moving a full-size car. The LF9's design shortcuts were legendary. Engineers left the same headbolt pattern as the gasoline V8s to save on manufacturing costs, forgetting that diesel engines have much higher compression. This meant headbolts snapped, heads warped, and engines literally fell apart if you pushed them too hard. GM also decided not to install a water separator to deal with low-quality diesel fuel. This caused corrosion in the injector pumps and made fixing problems a never-ending cycle. Some people tried adding alcohol to fuel to remove water, but this just dissolved seals and made the problem worse. Owners had to fight this engine constantly. Even simple maintenance, like checking the timing chain or fuel system, became a battle. Dealer mechanics were often unprepared for the disasters arriving at their bays, and the cars could break down before even completing a smog test. Lawsuits piled up, class actions demanded compensation, and the cars that had these engines often ended up back at the factory or had their diesels replaced with gasoline V8s. By 1985, GM quietly retired the LF9 from passenger cars, leaving a long shadow of distrust over diesel engines in North America for decades. The LF9 was also extremely noisy. Unlike a smooth gasoline V8, it rattled, clanged, and groaned while releasing black smoke that looked like a fog machine at a terrible party. Low-speed torque was weak despite being a diesel, so it couldn't even haul itself with confidence. On top of all this, the engine's extra weight due to the larger pistons, iron crankshaft, and revised heads made cars sluggish, aggravating the already miserable performance. People could see the potential for fuel savings, but the endless mechanical issues turned any initial excitement into frustration and regret. Even though the LF9 technically achieved better fuel economy, up to 30 miles per gallon if you drove like a snail, the cost and reliability and stress far outweighed the savings. Cadillac, Buick, Chevrolet, and Oldsmobile models with this engine all suffered, tarnishing reputations that had been built for decades. The diesel V8's failure scared American drivers away from diesels for more than 30 years, and it left a legacy of black smoke, broken parts, and broken dreams. It's a lesson in how cutting corners, chasing regulations, and ignoring proper diesel engineering can turn a V8 into one of the most infamous engines in history. Number 8. Chevrolet Turbo Thrift 230 i6, 1965 to 1969. If you ever wanted to know what disappointment sounds like when you twist a key, let me introduce you to the Chevrolet Turbo Thrift 230 Inline 6. The name sounds fast, right? Turbo, Thrift, but wait a second, because nothing about this motor is really turbo. And most drivers found out the thrift part just meant you got bored slowly. And trust me, when an engine is more famous for yawns than for speed, you know trouble is coming. Now, the first problem starts with the word turbo. There is no turbocharger here, not a little one, not a big one, nothing at all. Imagine ordering an ice cream sundae with sprinkles, chocolate, and whipped cream, but the waiter only gives you a plain scoop of vanilla. That is exactly how people felt when they bought a car with this motor. The name promised fireworks, but under the hood, you got a lawnmower that ate too much breakfast. And speaking of breakfast, this engine was heavy. With its cast iron block and head, it added pounds that the little one-barrel carburetor could never keep up with. It made 140 horsepower on paper, but that was on a very good day with the wind behind you and the car rolling downhill. Most of the time, it coughed, wheezed, and begged you to please slow down. Drivers joked that it needed a calendar to measure 0 to 60 miles per hour because a stopwatch was way too quick. But wait, the headaches did not stop there. The design used a shared intake port for every 2 cylinders, and right in the middle of that port sat a headbolt boss. Picture someone sticking their thumb in a garden hose, cutting the water flow in half. That is how the air and fuel mixture entered the engine. So even when it wanted to breathe better, the Turbo Thrift gasped like it had just run a marathon in cowboy boots. Now let's talk about the sound. You might think a 6-cylinder should purr or growl. Instead, this one groaned. It made a dull, droning note that felt more like a washing machine on spin cycle than a car engine. People joked that driving with the radio off was dangerous, not because of silence, but because you might fall asleep at the wheel from boredom. Maintenance was another circus. The carburetor was simple but stubborn. The valve train rattled like a drawer full of spoons, and oil leaks decorated driveways everywhere. Owners often complained that the engine would keep running forever, but not in a good way. More like a guest who never leaves the party, even when the chips are gone. Durable, yes, but exciting, never. And here comes the big shock. Imagine pairing this motor with a full-size car like an Impala. That was like strapping roller skates onto an elephant and hoping for a dance show. The car was too heavy, the engine too weak, and the end result was a slow-motion parade. Even the lighter Chevy 2 only managed to be not terrible. And that is not exactly the dream anyone had when buying something with the word turbo in its name. But here's the mystery that puzzled so many gearheads. Why did Chevrolet keep building this engine for years, even while V8s were stealing the spotlight with thunder and thrill? The answer sits in the name again, Thrift. It was cheap, it was simple, and it would not die no matter how much people wished it would. So, while some engines are loved, some are feared, and some are respected, the Turbo Thrift 230 inline 6 holds a special spot. It is the motor that nobody really wanted, but somehow too many people got stuck with anyway. Number 7, Triumph Stag V8. But if you thought the Turbo Thrift 230 inline 6 was bad, then buckle up, because the Triumph Stag V8 takes disappointment to a whole new level. A V8 engine, give a British GT car some punch. In fact, it was like two 4-cylinder engines awkwardly glued together and calling themselves a proper V8. People hoped for power and reliability, but instead got smoke, leaks, and a motor that loved to overheat more than a kid in a summer sun. The Stag's V8 started as a clever idea. Twin the existing inline-4 engine into a 152 cubic inch V8, add some carburetors instead of complicated fuel injection, and voila, you have a motor ready for the US market. But clever ideas don't always work. The carburetors made less power than the planned injection system. So engineers tried to increase displacement to 183 cubic inches by widening the cylinder bores. This created a huge problem. The larger bores ate into the space for coolant passages, leaving the engine barely able to keep itself cool. Imagine trying to fill a swimming pool with a teaspoon. That's how thirsty this engine was for cooling. The water pump made everything worse. Triumph mounted it in the V of the engine and drove it with internal gears. When the gears sheared, the water pump stopped, the coolant stopped moving, and the engine quickly heated up like a barbecue with no lid. Filling the system? Forget it. Unless you jacked the car up, the coolant would never reach the pump. One tiny leak, and the engine could toast itself faster than toast on high heat. Head studs were another disaster. Triumph decided to mount half straight and half at 20-degree angles. Supposedly, this made maintenance easier, but in reality, it warped cylinder heads as heat expanded the studs unevenly. Main bearings were too small, timing chains stretched every 25,000 miles, and the engine was an interference design, so a broken chain destroyed valves and pistons in one furious moment. Despite the angry growl at full throttle, the Stag V8's reliability issues meant drivers spent more time in garages than on open roads. The Rover 213 cubic inch V8 could have saved Triumph, but pride got in the way. Only 25,877 Stags were made, and less than 3,000 reached the US, leaving most Americans with a taste of British style and a mouthful of headaches. Number 6, Cadillac's 864. Even after the Triumph Stag V8 taught the world a lesson in frustration, the Cadillac 864 engine came along to show that American engineers could take complexity and turn it into pure chaos. The 366 cubic inch V8 sounded brilliant. The idea was simple: shut off cylinders when you didn't need them to save fuel. 2 cylinders off, you had a V6. 4 cylinders off, you had a V4. Sounds smart, right? In practice, it was like trying to juggle while riding a unicycle on a tightrope over a pit of lava. The first problem started with the computer. Cadillac bragged about 300,000 calculations per second, but the engine needed 1 million to keep up with real-world driving. The onboard brain simply couldn't process everything fast enough, leaving drivers with a motor that hesitated and lurched and seemed confused about whether it was supposed to be a V8, V6, or V4 at any given moment. Imagine your coffee machine deciding to pour half a cup, pause, then pour a full cup every single time you hit the gas. That's basically what the 864 did. Next, the rocker arms tried to follow the computer's commands, but they were too slow. When you pressed the accelerator, the engine couldn't react in time, leaving you with a car that felt like it was indecisively thinking about whether it wanted to move or not. Fuel injection and cylinder deactivation often clashed, sending too much or too little fuel into the engine, which sometimes made it cough, sputter, or jerk forward like a teenager learning to drive a stick shift. Cadillac even put a gauge on the dashboard, called the MPG Sentinel, to show how many cylinders were active. Drivers quickly realized it was completely useless, because the engine's hesitation and lurching already made it obvious how confused it was. Real-world fuel savings, about 15% after all that drama. The throttle body design also allowed fuel to pool on the intake valves and then dump unpredictably, turning acceleration into a surprise game of will it or won't it? 13 software updates later, Cadillac admitted defeat. The 864 was gone after just one model year, replaced by a simpler 250 cubic inch V8. Owners who kept their cars had the cylinder deactivation system permanently disabled, leaving the motor to hum along on all 8 cylinders, blissfully unaware of its failed experiment. The 864 shows that sometimes being ahead of your time doesn't mean being good. It was a bold attempt at innovation that became a headache for everyone involved. A cautionary tale that even luxury cars aren't immune to poor execution. Modern cylinder deactivation works fine now, but the Cadillac 864 will always be remembered as the engine that overpromised, underdelivered, and made drivers pray for the simplicity of full 8-cylinder power. Number 5. 152 cubic inch Duratec V6, 1997. Some engines promise power, but this one promises headaches. The Ford Duratec 152 cubic inch V6 from 1997 was supposed to be smooth, quick, and reliable. On paper, it had dual overhead cams, 24 valves, and a V configuration that looked impressive. In real life, it became one of the most hated motors for everyday drivers and mechanics alike. Let's start with power. With 200 horsepower at 6,250 revolutions per minute and 169 pound-feet of torque, at 4,250 revolutions per minute. Sounds okay, but in reality, pressing the gas felt like poking a sleeping bear with a feather. Drivers expected excitement and got polite yawns instead. The engine loved to spin high, but never gave much push at low speeds, leaving cars sluggish when they should have been lively. Next comes noise and fuss. The timing chain had a habit of rattling, and ignoring it could lead to bent valves or broken parts. The aluminum block and heads warped easily if the cooling system had the slightest trouble. A small coolant leak could quickly turn into smoke, blown gaskets, or steam clouds under the hood. The cooling system was finicky, and overheating was common enough to make drivers nervous on sunny days. Accessing parts under the hood was another headache. Spark plugs hid in deep holes, requiring patience, long tools, and a lot of swearing for a simple change. Mechanics joked that changing plugs on this motor was a full gym workout. The intake chain drive sometimes stretched and made odd sounds, and fixing it was never straightforward. Even though it looked modern, this engine had flaws everywhere, from crankcase design to valve layout. Number 4. Pontiac Iron Duke engine. If you thought dealing with spark plugs that required a small expedition was bad, the Pontiac Iron Duke engine was ready to show you just how far plain but persistent could go. The Iron Duke was a 152 cubic inch 4-cylinder designed to be simple, but was more like a lukewarm bowl of oatmeal with a side of homework. Serviceable, but boring, and occasionally frustrating in ways that made you question why it even existed. The first thing that kills excitement is the power, or lack of it. At 87 horsepower in its earliest versions, the Iron Duke felt more like it was politely suggesting motion rather than actually delivering it. Even after upgrades, it barely made it to 110 horsepower, which was enough to get the car moving, but not nearly enough to excite anyone expecting fun from a Camaro or Fiero. Imagine trying to run a race while everyone else is in rocket-powered shoes, and you're shuffling along in flip-flops. That was the Pontiac Iron Duke in a nutshell. Reliability, however, was surprisingly decent. The engine kept running through cold mornings, hot afternoons, and the occasional "I hope it makes it home" panic, much like an old dishwasher that refuses to quit. It never threw temper tantrums, it never quit unexpectedly, and it never demanded constant attention. Mail trucks used it for decades, quietly surviving while drivers silently cursed the lack of thrill. You could count on it, but you couldn't admire it. The real heartbreak comes from its internal limitations. The crankshaft was lightweight and would wobble above 5,000 revolutions per minute. Connecting rods and pistons weren't built for fun, and the cylinder block was as stiff as a wet noodle in high-stress situations. Any attempt to make this engine scream like a true sports engine would almost certainly end with broken parts, frustrated hands, and a very quiet commute. Stock, it could barely compete with a mild V6, and pushing it beyond that required special parts, aftermarket support, and a willingness to gamble on which internal component would survive. Speaking of modifications, Pontiac eventually offered the Super Duty aluminum head, forged crankshaft, and performance components for those brave enough to upgrade. With enough aftermarket wizardry, a normally meek Iron Duke could reach 200 or more horsepower and even compete in serious racing events. But remember, that required a complete rebuild, specialized tools, and patience that borders on saintly. Most drivers, however, were left with a stock engine that hummed along politely, never whining, never roaring, but also never thrilling. Ultimately, the Pontiac Iron Duke engine is a story of safe, dependable mediocrity. It does exactly what it was asked to do: move a car from point A to point B without dying. Number 3, Buick/Range Rover V8. If the Pontiac Iron Duke made you sigh with relief that at least it ran, then the Buick 215 cubic inch V8, later known as the Rover V8, was the kind of engine that made engineers scratch their heads and mechanics groan into their wrenches. This all-aluminum V8, first introduced in 1961, promised a lot. Lightweight, compact size, and plenty of power for small cars like the Buick Special and Skylark. It sounded perfect, like finding a chocolate cake in the fridge that says, "Eat me." But oh, how quickly that chocolate turned into a disappointment. The first problem was the aluminum block itself. Aluminum is lighter than iron, yes, but it is also trickier to work with. Early versions had cylinder liner issues that persisted for 3 long years. Imagine trying to pour soup into a bowl that keeps cracking. That was the challenge Buick faced. Eventually, they switched to iron liners, but even that only patched part of the problem. Production aluminum blocks were prone to hidden holes and porosity. Oil and coolant leaks became a regular headache for owners, leaving mechanics shaking their heads while muttering words that would get a sailor expelled from his ship. Sealing issues were just the start. The engine used a forward-mounted distributor and an external oil pump integrated into the timing cover, which, while clever in theory, meant that exposure to air and road grime could cause unusual wear or even premature failure. Every time you looked under the hood, it felt like a mechanical minefield where a misplaced hand or wrench could start a chain reaction of small disasters. What should have been a lightweight, nimble V8 felt fragile, and people quickly learned that pushing it too hard often led to cracked blocks or warped cylinder heads. Buick's engineers also struggled with compression ratios and carburetor setups. The 2-barrel version made a humble 150 horsepower, and the 4-barrel option promised 185, which sounded great until the engine started whining about fuel quality. Higher compression required very specific gasoline, which was not always easy to find in the early 1960s. Owners would tune, retune, and still find the engine underwhelming, and sometimes it would mysteriously overheat, leaving a puddle of coolant on the driveway like a tiny betrayal. The Oldsmobile variant, the Rocket V8, tried to fix some of these problems by adding an extra bolt on the intake side, changing piston design, and creating a turbocharged version called the Turbo Rocket. Even then, the turbo version was finicky. Boost at 5 pounds per square inch could lift power to 215 horsepower. But owners soon realized that any mistake in maintenance or timing could make the engine feel like it had a temper tantrum. The Oldsmobile blocks even found their way to Australian Formula One racers for a while, which is impressive until you remember that the engines had to be completely rebuilt to survive racing, not exactly a plug-and-play solution. Then came the production nightmare. Aluminum casting technology of the early 1960s was not mature, and hidden porosity meant high rejection rates on the assembly line. Blocks would leak oil before the engine ever left the factory, which meant extra inspections, rework, and endless frustration for Buick employees. Combined with sensitivity to certain antifreeze mixtures that clogged radiators, the engines developed a reputation for being difficult to maintain. Simple repairs turned into multi-hour puzzles, and drivers often learned that the lightweight and compact design did not come without a price. Constant vigilance and a touch of fear every time the engine was revved. By 1964, Buick had given up on aluminum production blocks and switched to cast iron, leaving the innovative alloy V8 as a cautionary tale. Rover saw an opportunity across the Atlantic, purchased the rights, and began refining it for British cars like the P6 and Range Rover. They strengthened it, tuned it, and gave it a second life. But the engine's early history in America left a legacy of frustration and wary admiration. Number 2, 1975 Pontiac 301 V8. By the late 1970s, Pontiac decided it was time to try something bold, but the result was the 301 cubic inch V8, an engine that promised efficiency and power, but often delivered headaches and frustration instead. This engine, offered from 1977 to 1981, was lighter than its big block siblings thanks to thin wall castings and a short deck design. The first problem was the crankshaft. Unlike most V8s that had 5 counterweights to keep things smooth, the Pontiac 301 only had 2. That meant a lot more vibration and shaking under load, like trying to balance a wobbly table while carrying a tray of drinks. Connecting rod journals were lightened, which sounded smart until owners realized that pushing the engine hard could lead to premature wear. This was not the type of engine you wanted to drive aggressively, unless your goal was to make frequent trips to the mechanic. Cylinder heads had a new design with Siamese intake ports, which meant 2 cylinders shared a single path for air and fuel. It sounds fancy, but it caused uneven airflow and reduced efficiency, leaving some cylinders gasping while others chugged along. The intake manifold had to be redesigned to match, creating a Frankenstein-like combination that was tricky to tune. Even Pontiac admitted the horsepower ranged from 135 to 170, but real-world drivers often found it underwhelming for a V8. Then came the turbocharged version, the infamous 301 Turbo. It was Pontiac's first attempt at forced induction, using an exhaust-driven turbocharger to squeeze more power out of the engine. Officially, it produced 210 horsepower in 1980 and 200 in 1981. The numbers sound impressive until you realize that the carburetor-based fuel system could not fully keep up with the forced air, leaving the engine prone to detonation if the timing was not perfect. The electronic spark controller helped by retarding timing when knock was detected, but it often felt like a nervous babysitter trying to keep the engine from exploding. Internal components were stronger than the naturally aspirated 301, with forged pistons, a high-pressure oil pump, a baffled oil pan, and a rolled fillet crankshaft. Yet even these reinforcements could not fully compensate for the engine's quirks. Owners reported overheating, turbo lag, and occasional oil starvation under hard driving. The wastegate, meant to regulate boost, was delicate, and any improper adjustments could turn the engine into a ticking time bomb of rattles and puffs of smoke. The turbo system also required unique plumbing, a specific heater core box, and automatic transmissions with a lockup torque converter, which made maintenance more complicated. Low-octane fuels common in the early 1980s added another layer of stress, as even small missteps could cause severe detonation. Drivers found themselves babysitting their cars more than enjoying the promised power, and the engine gained a reputation as a high-strung and temperamental companion rather than a reliable friend. While it technically fulfilled its role of moving cars, it did so with a level of fuss and fragility that frustrated owners and mechanics alike. Despite clever engineering ideas, the combination of a short deck block, thin wall castings, Siamese ports, and early turbo technologies made this engine one of the most disliked V8s in Pontiac history. Number 1. 1980s Chrysler 318. Some engines make you feel like you won the lottery just by saying their name. Others make you wonder why anyone ever bothered. The Chrysler 318 from the 1980s belongs firmly in the second camp. A 318 cubic inch V8 sounds like it should roar, but in reality, most of these engines barely hummed past 150 horsepower. That is less than some modern 4-cylinder cars, and anyone hoping for instant thrills was left checking their watch while waiting for anything exciting to happen. Part of the problem lies in the block itself. Chrysler used a short deck design with thin wall castings to save weight and materials. In theory, it was smart. In practice, it made the engine a bit of a delicate flower. Push it too hard and you risked warping or cracking parts. Combine that with Siamese ports, which crowd the intake and exhaust valves together, and the airflow suffers. Engines hate to breathe poorly, just like people hate running with a stuffy nose. This limitation meant the Chrysler 318 struggled to make strong power at higher RPMs, leaving it feeling flat and lazy compared to its Mopar siblings, like the 340 and 360. Then there's the Valvetrain. These engines originally came with hydraulic flat tappet lifters. They worked fine if treated gently, but if oil levels dropped even slightly or the engine overheated, lifters would go noisy, stick, or fail completely. A stuck lifter is like a hiccup that never stops. It ruins the rhythm of the whole engine. Camshafts were also very conservative, barely lifting the valves enough to encourage real airflow. Cylinder heads added to the headache. Early 2-barrel 318 heads had small valves and tiny ports, limiting airflow even more. 4-barrel heads were slightly better, but the combustion chambers were so large that compression stayed low, hurting power and throttle response. Low compression made it hard for the engine to feel energetic without revving too high, and high revs stressed the already thin castings. Additionally, fuel and ignition systems did not help. Low-octane gasoline was common, which made detonation a real threat. The timing had to be precise, or the engine would ping and groan under load. For drivers, it meant constant attention to maintenance, almost like babysitting a fussy pet. Combine that with the occasional vacuum leak, worn-out cam, or timing issue, and the 318 gained a reputation for being high maintenance rather than heroic. Even police departments and fleet users, who relied on durability, eventually discovered the limits. It could run hot, sip oil, and keep going, but extracting performance was a tricky game. Enthusiasts quickly learned that while the engine could move a car, it did so with a fussiness that tested patience. For many, the 1980s Chrysler 318 became shorthand for a V8 that tries but often fails to impress. The turbo system also required unique plumbing, a specific heater core box, and automatic transmissions with a lockup torque converter, which made maintenance more complicated. Low-octane fuels common in the early 1980s added another layer of stress, as even small missteps could cause severe detonation. Although drivers found themselves babysitting their cars more than enjoying the promised power, and the engine gained a reputation as a high-strung and temperamental companion rather than a reliable friend. While it technically fulfilled its role of moving cars, it did so with a level of fuss and fragility that frustrated owners and mechanics alike. Which one do you think is the most hated muscle car engine of all time? If you enjoyed this, drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more car content.